with that said, what do we start off with? Let's start off with the slippery slope of Canada. And where we're going. Let me see. Here we go. Let's bring this up. Let's bring this up, people, and just revel in what we're listening to. David Lametti, for those of you who don't know, is the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. That is AKA MOJAG, because we have our acronyms in Canada as well. Americans, you don't get to keep SCOTUS and POTUS and what else is there? PressSec. Well, anyways, we have our acronyms. They just happen to suck. MOJAG is a terrible acronym. It sounds like a terrible show from the 80s. MOJAG. Minister of Justice and Attorney General. For those of you who are not new to the channel, you've heard this term before because Jody Wilson-Raybould, the first Indigenous female who was ever appointed as MOJAG by Justin Trudeau because he's so progressive and tolerant and wonderful, not misogynistic, not racist, not discriminatory at all. Justin Trudeau appointed Jody Wilson-Raybould, the first Indigenous woman, to the position of MOJAG, only to subsequently demote her, shuffle her out of the cabinet when she refused to adhere to his corrupt demands to not prosecute SNC-Lavalin, this construction conglomerate, for corruption because, Justin Trudeau had his reasons for suspending the application of justice with respect to certain corruption. The Minister of Justice and Attorney General, it's a two-hatted figure, and they almost have sort of a conflict of interests in that function as Minister of Justice, which is to implement the laws of the land, and the Attorney General, which is to advise the Prime Minister. So it's an interesting position. It's always had some constitutional issues with it because, on the one hand, the Minister of Justice has to apply the rule of law, has to apply the law of the land, independently of against whom they are applying the law of the land, whereas the Attorney General advises the Prime Minister, advises the administration. So it's an interesting bifurcated position under the law, under the Constitution. Okay. Setting all that aside, but any time is a good time to remind everyone of Justin Trudeau's lack of ethics and corruption in his treatment of the first Indigenous woman ever appointed to MOJAG. Do what I say, you, or I boot you from my office if you do not adhere to my corrupt demands, which led to an ethics violation against Justin Trudeau. This is her replacement. Justin Trudeau, because it's 2020 and we need to have women and minorities in our cabinet, when they don't do what we say, we shuffle them out and we replace them with David Lametti. How many of you knew everything that I just said? Were you all familiar with all of the information that I just gave as a precursor to this tweet, which we're going to get into? Yes or no in the chat while I sip my natural sugar, organic, proudly organic. Okay, we got one yes. Okay, good. Yeah, so okay, yes, some no's, a lot more yeses than no. Some no's. I was not, sir. Good. Mr. Steve, VC, Virginia is for lovers. Ooh, yeah. I might be in Virginia. In fact, I think I'm going to be back in Virginia sooner than later. To be announced. Yes, no, yes, no. What did you say again? I wasn't listening. Can you start again? All right, this is Lametti. This is Lametti, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. The man whose job it is to uphold and enforce the law of the land. Listen to this gem.
Minister Lametti, I want to ask you about C-19 and the idea of seizing and selling off Russian assets. The idea that some observers say that is on shaky legal ground. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, we'll obviously tailor the provisions so that it could withstand a.
Can we just appreciate the hemming and hawing? Maybe I'm not the best person to criticize someone else for hemming and hawing, not getting to the answer. We're 20 seconds in. This dude hasn't started to offer an answer to the question. They say the question is Bill C-19, whatever. It's the seizure of Russian assets. It's on shaky legal ground. How do you respond to that?
Some observers say that is on shaky legal ground. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, we'll obviously tailor the provisions so that it could withstand a court challenge. You don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada.
I'm sorry, what did you just say?
It could withstand
What did you
court
just say?
challenge. You don't have an absolute right to own private property. You don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada. It is there are steps that are taken when expropriations happen at whatever level of government, and we'll be sure to stay within those boundaries. You don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada.
You don't have an absolute right to own private property in
Right
Canada.
to own private property.
Now, in fairness to Lametti, maybe he's talking only about Russian nationals, foreigners who are not Canadian citizens. Maybe that's who he's talking about. So got to give him the benefit of the doubt. Contextually, maybe that's what he meant.
Court challenge. You don't have an absolute right to own private property.
Although he didn't say they don't have an absolute right. He said to the reporter, you don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada.
It is there are steps that are taken when expropriations happen at whatever level of government, and we'll be sure to stay within those boundaries.
We'll be sure to stay within those boundaries. You don't have an absolute right to own private property in Canada. David Lametti is the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Député LaSalle Emerald Verdun. That's actually down the street from me. Ministre de la Justice et Procureur Général du Canada. En français, c'est le MJP. Minister of Justice, Attorney General of Canada. Oh, he has his pronouns in French and English. Okay. Sorry, I hadn't seen that until now. David Lametti is a Minister of Justice. Try to align his statement with Section 8 of the Charter of Rights prohibiting unreasonable search and seizure. No need to try. No need to try. Let's just, I don't want to stop cam. I want to share screen, Dave. Come on. Need a producer. Where is the Constitutions Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? I know we've looked at this together, people. It is always worth looking at again so we can see what rights we have and how whimsically they can be whisked away from our existence. This is the Constitution Act of 1982, the portion that basically ratified fundamental rights from violation from the government. Incorporated into the Constitution in 1982. We had on Brian Peckford, and he discussed this entire process, the ordeal that this was. Listen to this. This is our Constitution Act. And I think, it bears repeating the preamble. Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of capital G God and the rule of law. It recognizes the supremacy of God and the rule of law in so much as the government says that it does. Charter rights. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law. Flipping this to COVID, half of the edicts that have been imposed as law never went through any legislative process. So whether or not they would even satisfy this exclusion, had they been passed into law, they had never been passed into law, but that's a discussion we've had on another date. Reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be reasonably justified in a free and democratic society. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, refers to, or was codified, was interpreted by the courts in the Oakes test, OAKES test. And there were a number of criteria that the infringement had to be necessary, effective, as minimal as possible, and directly tailored to meet the ends of the objective, but whatever. Let's just look at some of our fundamental rights. Apparently, ownership of private property is not one of them anymore. Everyone has the following fundamental rights, fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience and religion, unless we've determined that a virus shuts down your ability to practice religion. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the freedom of the press and other media of communication, unless we've determined that that's misinformation and therefore you don't have the right to that press or that media of communication. Freedom of peaceful assembly, Unless you're Maxime Bernier in the time of a pandemic who's having an outdoor political gathering of 30 some odd people, then you don't have the right to peaceful assembly. But Justin Trudeau, Doug Ford, who attend not a rally, but rather when you commemorate a vigil with thousands of people, they can do it. But Maxime Bernier arrested and detained for 32 people outside for a political rally. Freedom of association. Okay, fine. Democratic rights. Okay, let's skip this. Mobility rights. Can you imagine that the government is saying that homelessness should be outlawed? Everyone should have the right to a home, while simultaneously saying you don't have a fundamental right to ownership of private property. But anyways, let's just get to it. Here, search and seizure. Everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. But you do not have a guaranteed right to private ownership of property in Canada, out of the mouth of Lametti, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.